Beneath the yawning canopy of stars, where galaxies spiral like drifting embers and silence carries the weight of forgotten ages, there exists a throne carved out of eternity itself. It is a seat held by one known only as the Empress, a sovereign whose voice commands fleets that eclipse suns, whose hand has shattered dynasties in a single gesture. Her empire lies suspended like a crown of fire across the heavens, its subjects kneeling in awe, its adversaries burning in dread. And yet, for all the thunder of her realm, for all the iron and flame that bow before her gaze, what follows is not her tale alone. It begins instead with one overlooked, one dismissed so thoroughly that his existence passed like dust on the winds of eternity. A human, a creature of fragile bone and fleeting breath, a species regarded as brittle curiosities, relics from a forgotten corner of the galaxy. In the chronicles of the mighty, they are little more than footnotes. In the eyes of warriors built from steel and stormlight, they are subjects of mockery. But here, in the silent crossroads of fate, it is this small, unseen figure who would rise from shadow and lay his hand upon destiny's pulse. He had no weapons forged of plasma, no bloodline traced to the ancients. He carried no strength that could crush a titan. Instead, he bore what the vast empire had overlooked: patience, memory, and a fragile will that did not bend, even when the universe conspired to ignore him. And soon, though none yet knew it, an act so simple, so utterly unremarkable to the sneering gaze of empires, would echo louder than wars. He would shield a life more precious than stars. He would defy the endless order of the galaxy's cruel throne. He would awaken in the strongest empress a feeling she could not conquer, because no blade of conquest can master the quiet power of gratitude or the disarming strength of compassion. Yet at this point in the tale, he was still unseen, still mocked, still cast aside. A drifting shadow at the edge of eternity. The Empress did not yet know his name. The Empire did not yet witness his worth. And the stars held their breath, waiting for that single instant when history would fracture, forever altered by the smallest of hands. Before we step into this forgotten legend, before the moment when a child's cry pierces the halls of power and weakness becomes salvation, pause and prepare. Because what follows is not merely the tale of a ruler or her throne. It is the story of how the fragile fool no one noticed would become the turning point of galaxies. And his first step begins. Now, the eternal empire stretched across 1,000 burning suns, its dominion older than some galaxies themselves. Worlds pulsed beneath its banner like jewels set in a crown forged of blood. Here, power was not whispered but thundered into existence. Armies clad in plates of living metal moved like oceans of fire, their weapons humming with histories of ruin. Scholars, their minds threaded with machines, spoke in equations that bent gravity to their command. Priests sang hymns carved into the fabric of stars. And above them all, luminous and terrible, sat the Empress, a sovereign wrapped in storms, her presence a weight that even space itself seemed unwilling to carry. And in the heart of such grandeur, there existed shadows, hidden corners of the empire where weaker species lingered, tolerated not for their value, but for the same reason one keeps fading relics in a hall of glory, reminders that even weakness has a place so long as it kneels. Among these forgotten was humanity, small, brittle, unremarkable. Where other races glowed with bioluminescent veins, or towered with bodies sculpted for war, the human body looked fragile, too easy to break. Their lifespans brief, their sciences crude, their strength laughed at by the children of the empire, and so they passed unseen, often as menials or laborers, repairing what others considered beneath their dignity. They lived quiet lives in back corridors, always walking quickly, eyes lowered in the presence of those who carried the weight of stars on their shoulders. It was in one such corridor, long and metallic, echoing with distant hymns of soldiers' training, that our overlooked figure could often be found. A simple human, his hands stained with grease, his clothing frayed from work. He repaired what no one else bothered with, cracked conduits snaking through the palace's lower levels, ancient vents complaining with the sigh of age, instruments once glorious now neglected by progress. His tools were not magnificent. They were battered, forged of old iron and patience. His eyes carried no fire, no burning gleam, only focus. Yet to the giants around him, his diligence drew laughter. "Why let such fragile things crawl our halls?" warriors muttered, their armor blazing brighter than the lamps above them. Sometimes they would stop and watch him toil, waiting for his hands to slip, for a fragile bone to crack under weight, for some moment of comedy. And when he succeeded in some menial repair, their laughter turned sharper still. Is this the best of your kind? Fixing what no warrior would lower themselves to touch. His silence was their delight, his humility their sport. But humiliation had long become familiar, worn into him like an old scar. He bore it without retaliation, without anger, without even trembling. He bent his head lower, allowed the laughter to wash past him, and returned to his work. Unseen, unheard, unremarkable. Above him, above all, the throne room glittered like the eye of infinity itself. There, pillars of light reached into shadow, banners woven from solar winds rippled like flame. It was a place where power gathered to be displayed, where endless rows of warriors and dignitaries could be summoned, their laughter echoing like thunder whenever the weak stumbled into view. And in that place, at the apex of arrogance, humans existed only as afterthoughts, tolerated ghosts. The contrast was monstrous. The mighty walked in hallways of crystal latticed with dark matter, their voices carrying like organ notes, while this lone human worked in silence, hands blackened, clothes worn. If strength was measured by appearance, then his weakness seemed absolute. But in that silence, something unconquered stirred. The empire, blinded by its light, could not see the value carried in memory, in patience, in humility older than its mighty wars. This mockery, this dismissal, was but the mask that let him move unseen. And history, relentless as the turning of galaxies, was already waiting for him. The laughter that spilled so easily from jeweled lips would soon falter, and the empire's hierarchy, proud and cruel, did not yet know that their mockery was not the prelude to his destruction. It was the sharpening silence before their awe. The day began like a procession carved from legend. The great hall of the eternal empire blazed with light, its vaulted ceilings echoing with the pulse of power. Courtiers moved in silent reverence. Warriors glistened in armor filament with living electricity. Priests chanted hymns that sang in every tongue of the galaxy. At the apex of the hall, upon a dais no mortal dared look upon directly, sat the Empress, veiled in radiance, unmoving, untouchable, a figure that seemed less a ruler and more the embodiment of inevitability itself. And then, like a ripple touching still water, something broke the ceremony. A sound, small, fragile, entirely human in its innocence. The cry of her child, the heir to eternity, the infant whose bloodline was destined to inherit the universe itself. In that hall, stronger than armies, yet weaker than a whisper, the infant's cry stirred hearts that had forgotten what vulnerability was. Eyes turned to the delicate form wrapped in shimmering cloth. For all the Empire's terrible strength, it was this tiny life that bore the greatest weight of all, the continuation of power eternal. But fate is cruel when least expected. A sudden tremor shook the chamber. At first, a flicker, a strange vibration coursing through the great engines that powered the Empress's throned hall. Then, a crackle of alarms no one had heard in centuries. The floor shuddered, courtiers froze, priests faltered mid-hymn. Then the realization spread like fire. An assassination device had been planted, nestled deep in the very core of the hall's life-sustaining systems. Ancient engines shivered under strain, their fires threatening collapse. The glow above warped as conduits sparked violently. One burst apart, showering sparks not meters from the air's cradle. Panic surged where reverence once ruled. Warriors cried out, priests shielded their faces, dignitaries scattered like leaves before the storm. But for the first time in memory, the Empress did not move. Not because she was slow, but because power failed her in its most essential form. She could crush planets, she could command fleets, but engines groaning under sabotage were enemies that did not bend to threats. Her hand reached, yet the device's complexity mocked even her brilliance. The cradle rocked, the infant cried louder, the future trembled on the brink of annihilation. And in that vast cathedral of awe and terror, someone stepped forward. Not a warrior with a blazing blade, not a priest armed with chants older than the galaxy, not one of the scholars who bent gravity like thread. It was the human, the overlooked, the unnoticed mechanic still marked by grease upon his hands, the one mocked only hours before. At first, none registered it. His thin figure was lost in the storm of grandeur. But when he placed his hands upon the shuddering conduits, eyes widened in confusion. Soldiers sneered, expecting folly. Dignitaries gasped at the insolence. Rage even flickered in the throned shadows of the Empress herself. Yet his hands did not tremble. His movements were practiced, deliberate. He listened not to the glares or the hymns silenced in shock, but to the groan of ancient machines, to the breath of the engine's rhythm. Knowledge nearly forgotten stirred in his mind. Lessons of simple machines taught on a blue planet so long dismissed, knowledge abandoned by a galaxy too proud in its own evolution. He moved with certainty, touching valves others would never notice, shifting pressures as though calming a wild beast. Sparks rained around him, but where others recoiled, he endured. And then silence. The alarms stilled. The engines breathed again. The hall ceased its trembling. The child's cradle, trembling on the brink, rocked gently to stillness. The infant's cry softened. The Empire's heart, for a moment, ceased to beat. What none expected had occurred. The weakest among them had saved the strongest bloodline. And as the dust settled, as eyes shifted in disbelief from the human's scarred hands to the Empress's frozen gaze, one truth rang louder than hymns. History had just been broken open by one no one thought worthy to remember. But the human's act, instead of being celebrated, would become a target. For where the mighty feel threatened, suspicion always follows salvation. The hall did not erupt in celebration. No, it drowned in silence darker than space itself. The human still knelt by the calmed machine, his chest rising with steady breaths, his hands blackened with soot and sparks. The Empress's child slept once more, fragile and unharmed. Yet the eyes of the court did not regard him with gratitude. They regarded him with unease, with suspicion, with a fear cloaked not in gasps, but in whispers carried low like the hiss of venom. And fear breeds cruelty. From among the legions of armored titans, a single figure stepped forward. He was carved not of flesh alone but of conquest, a warlord who had rose bloodied through hierarchies of flame, his victories told in the scorched remains of defeated worlds. His armor shone darker than night, etched with scars that glistened like trophies. His name was spoken only in reverence and in dread. Lord Veyrak, commander of the Empress's outer legions, the hand that broke rebellions before they dared call themselves wars. His voice cut like iron dragged across stone. A human, he thundered, the word itself spitting contempt, claims the right to touch the heart of our throne? To lay his brittle hands upon the life of the heir? No, I say no. The court stirred. Dignitaries nodded eagerly, desperate to prove their zeal in echoing his fury. Even priests raised their chants once more, this time not in hymns of reverence, but of warning. And still the Empress sat unmoving, her gaze unreadable behind the veil of blinding brilliance. Veyrak, fueled by the tension, strode until he towered before the human. His shadow fell long, blotting out what little dignity the man's posture clung to. If this creature would prove he is not a heretic spy, if he insists the throne should believe in his accident of chance, then let him be tested. The hall approved with roars of assent. A test, a trial, an entertainment disguised as judgment. For the mighty are never content with quiet disbelief. They must see humiliation played before their eyes to feel secure. And so the first trial was born. From the higher tiers of the court, scholars removed a relic long left untouched. A device wrought in the Empire's earliest days, forged half of machine, half of living intelligence. It was an artifact meant to shame initiates, a puzzle of interlocking cores designed to bend even genius into error. Most who attempted it failed beneath the jeers of their peers. The record for success was a silence centuries long. They placed it before the human, a sphere of shifting plates, its surface sliding like restless continents. Lights flickered from within, scattering patterns across the chamber walls like specters. Each twist of the artifact spawned a dozen new riddles, its voice whispering in 1,000 tongues. In me lies order, in me lies ruin. Break me and I break you. Veyrak's voice rang again, dripping venom. Let him show us what he is. Prove the salvation was no trick of coward's luck. The court erupted in laughter. Dignitaries leaned forward eagerly. Priests intoned predictions of failure. Warriors' boots thundered in amusement. To them, it was over before it began. What could a mechanic, a human, do with this relic that had humbled minds greater than galaxies? Yet the human did not tremble. He stood, silent, his shadow small upon the golden floor. His eyes studied the puzzle not with awe, but recognition. For while the Empire had discarded such relics as primitive curiosities of their own past, humanity had never forgotten the intimacy of simplicity. To him, beneath its alien glow, it resembled something he had touched once before, the quiet mechanics of locks, gears, and celestial maps studied in the ruins of old Earth. The court jeered as he pressed fingers to its surface, expecting chaos, expecting failure. But slowly, deliberately, he traced the hum of its patterns. He moved not like warrior or priest, but like one who listened. Each click of a rotating plate echoed like a heartbeat, and with each turn, light stabilized where once it raged. Fragments aligned. The whispers softened. He coaxed it, not dominated it. Minutes felt eternal. Gasps replaced laughter. And then the sphere opened. Light poured outward in gentle silence, blooming above the hall like the dawn of some long-buried sun. Its whisper ceased at last, whispering only one phrase before falling into stillness, balance restored. The chamber was stunned. Warriors who had laughed fell silent. Scholars gaped in disbelief. Even the priests stumbled over their hymns, their certainty dissolving. The fragile one had done what none of them could. He had solved the unyielding riddle. But not all were silent. Verak's voice roared anew, harsher, cracked with fury. Tricks. This is coincidence again. Nothing more. Chance masquerading as wisdom. One trial does not silence suspicion. No. Let him face another. Let him be crushed beneath a challenge that no fraud could endure. And in the shadow of his wrath, the court stirred again. For humiliation unsatisfied always hungers for more. The first trial had been conquered. But the second, darker, greater test was already gathering like thunder on the horizon. Silence has a weight greater than thunder, and in the aftermath of the first trial, it pressed heavily upon the hall. The relic, long unsolved, rested open like a flower under the hands of the human. That fragile being, dismissed as little more than a novelty, had achieved what scholars and warriors had failed for centuries. The crowd, split between awe and unease, did not yet know whether to cheer or recoil. But Lord Verak knew only fury. Fury that burned hotter than suns. Fury that demanded spectacle. For humiliation of the weak is the Empire's sport, but humiliation unfulfilled curdles into a hunger darker still. His voice tore across the chamber. Enough of toys and trinkets. If this creature dares claim worth within the eyes of the throne, then let him face a trial none may call chance. Let him stand not before puzzles, but before truth itself. The court roared its approval, eager to watch the so-called miracle crumple before their eyes. Scholars prepared arcane devices, priests summoned scrolls of law, and warriors pounded their armored fists upon the floor in thunderous rhythm. The chamber rose as if alive, its vibrations echoing through every stone and star-forged arch above. Then the second trial was revealed. From the archives of the Empire, a test older than dynasties was summoned. The codices of dominion, fragments of the first laws carved when galaxies were still being tamed. These were scripts of paradox and prophecy, questions whispered into the marrow of existence itself. No one alive truly understood them. They were riddles of empire, woven with contradictions, used not to instruct but to crush. It was said even rulers once faltered before them, choosing silence over failure. And yet the fragile human was cast before them, as the chamber demanded spectacle. One of the codices unfurled, projecting glyphs of fire into the air, its voice emanating with choral resonance. What law binds strength when strength devours itself? What throne endures when fear is its master? What empire survives when the smallest hand can unmake its design? The hall erupted in laughter. Even the priests smirked, for how could such questions be answered? They were not built to yield meaning, but to expose weakness. Even the Empress, shrouded in argent light, tilted her head as though daring the human to falter. The man looked small before the burning glyphs, his frame hunched beneath their radiance. Yet his eyes did not flicker with panic. He bent his head, not in defeat, but in thought. His silence stretched. The court grew restless, waiting for his collapse. But then he raised his face, and he spoke not from scripture, not from the tongue of scholars. He answered in the language of simplicity, the one truth humanity had nurtured in obscurity. Strength, left alone, consumes itself. It must protect, else it is hollow. Fear cannot preserve a throne. Only loyalty freely given may stand unbroken. and empires survive only when they remember the powerless, because it is always the smallest hand that endures when the mighty fall. The court froze. For a moment unreal and eternal, silence draped its mantle across them all. Warriors blinked in disbelieving scorn. Priests lost their hymns mid-breath. Scholars struggled to scoff, for though his words were simple, they rang with the cadence of truths buried beneath centuries of arrogance. The codex trembled, glyphs shattering and rearranging. Slowly, impossibly, it folded itself shut. Its voice whispered one word only, answered. A gasp rolled like thunder through the hall. It was an acknowledgement no one had ever heard. For centuries, the codices had tormented those who dared question them. Never once had they spoken finality. And now they had declared the human victorious. Cheers burst from unexpected corners. Low-born soldiers, forgotten attendants, voices from the shadows emboldened. The sound grew like wildfire, rising past dignitaries who did not dare suppress it. They cheered not merely the man, but the audacity of a truth too old and too human to be ignored. The Empress's gaze, once unreadable, now lingered. Something unfamiliar stirred within her brilliance. Curiosity, respect, perhaps even gratitude, though such words had never dared define her. But Verac's rage only deepened. His fists clenched, his armor groaned as though straining to contain his wrath. He bellowed over the cheers, desperate to smother them. Lies! This is trickery again. He speaks riddles wrapped in peasants' phrases. Theft, not truth. The codices mock us with coincidence. Yet his words rang hollow. The court had seen, had heard, and the shift was undeniable. Where once laughter came freely at the human's expense, now disbelief wrestled with awe. Suspicion wrestled with wonder. For the second time, the fragile one had stood before impossibility and prevailed. But victories, when they cut so deeply into the pride of the mighty, are seldom left unpunished. Verac's eyes burned, and in their fire smoldered vengeance. He would not allow a human to walk away honored. He would unleash now a storm not of mind or word, but of destruction. For the third trial would not be clothed in puzzles, nor draped in questions. It would come in the only language the Empire had ever truly trusted, raw, merciless power. The storm of voices after the second trial rippled through the great hall like a sea unsettled. Some shouted denial, others whispered awe, and beneath it all, the fragile figure of the human stood unbowed. He had answered puzzles, quelled riddles, and calmed machines once thought untouchable. Yet still Lord Verac's fury boiled, demanding blood, demanding annihilation. But even fury faltered when something older than armies stirred. In the high vaults of the hall, carved into pillars that reached beyond sight, ancient inscriptions shimmered. Long had they lain quiescent, ignored by lords who trusted only in steel and fire. But now, as the air quivered, those forgotten runes awakened with light. The priests turned in horror, for the letters did not shine at random. They formed words buried in the marrow of legend. Prophecy, covenant, a warning etched when the empire itself had first been born out of starlight. From the dust reviled shall rise the hand unseen. Where mighty fail, the fragile endures. Where power crumbles, memory restores. Guard well the forgotten, for in them lies the balance of eternity. The words pulsed above them all, and as they glowed, faces turned one by one toward the mechanic, the fragile human who stood below. The court recoiled. Whispers rose. Could it be? The one mocked as less than nothing, painted across their holiest walls since before memory? Verac roared in denial, his armor clanging with violent motion. Blasphemy! The runes are tricked. This human cannot be the fragile one foretold. He is coincidence wrapped in cowardice. But denial could not sever truth. For when the human raised his hand, the light of the inscriptions pulsed brighter, as though answering him. It was not his choice that bound him to them. It was the Empire's own forgotten promise. The Empress, still and silent, leaned forward from her throne. Her gaze, long shrouded in veils of radiance, narrowed. And for the first time in an age, her voice descended like a blade across the chamber. Enough! The word silenced even Verac's rage. The priests fell to their knees. The warriors lowered their eyes. And in that silence, her words chained the air. These halls were raised on covenant. And the covenant speaks of the fragile hand. The runes do not lie. This human is bound to truths older than my throne. Her declaration rippled like shockwaves across the chamber. Hierarchies trembled, for if the Empress herself acknowledged the prophecy, then no soldier nor priest could wash it aside. Yet even within victory, danger lingered. Veyrak's face twisted with the last remnants of his fury. His pride, cut and bleeding, could not bend to truth. His denial hardened now into desperation. The court was shaken, the Empress was watching, and the words of prophecy burned above like stars. The fragile human had gone from nameless scrap to figure of destiny. But a cornered beast is always most dangerous, and Veyrak was far from finished. For prophecy might declare a fragile one chosen, but swords and blood were weapons still eager to silence destiny before it could take root in the marrow of empires. The throne hall trembled, not with prophecy this time, but with the roar of rage. Lord Veyrak, stripped of certainty, mocked by silence, and struck low by words older than empires, could not bend. Pride was his marrow, and humiliation its poison. He drew his blade, a weapon forged from the heart of a collapsed star. Its edge shimmered not with mere light, but with the threat of annihilation itself. Each swing of that blade across the ages had silenced rebellions, carved kingdoms into dust, and proven him the empire's executioner. Now, trembling with fury, he raised it high above the fragile mechanic. Prophecy be damned, his roar echoed. I will carve this weakness from the galaxy before it infects us all. The court recoiled, waves of shock and fear scattering through its ranks like broken glass. Priests muttered frantic contradictions, soldiers stepped back, scholars buried their faces. Yet none moved to intervene. For it is easy to cheer destiny from afar, but to intercept the blade of a warlord is another matter entirely. The mechanic stood alone before fire itself. But destiny is not silence, it is sound. Not absence, but resonance. As the blade descended, the hall itself reacted. The inscriptions above burst into burning light, casting lances of radiance that struck the weapon midair. Sparks exploded, not of steel against steel, but of history against arrogance. The ground split beneath Veyrak's feet. The codices that he had once used against the fragile one turned now against him, blinding his eyes with their glow. And through it all, the mechanic did not move in panic. He raised no weapon, bore no shield. He simply stood, as he had always stood, patient, steady, unmoved. The blade shuddered. The radiance refused its strike, and the weight of destiny proved heavier than the warlord's wrath. The once unstoppable weapon trembled, then cracked, then shattered into pieces that fell ringing onto the golden floor. Gasps ignited across the hall. The crowd surged, their awe erupting as one. Warriors who once jeered now struck their armored chests in unbidden salute. The codices whispered in thunderous unison, "The fragile hand endures." Veyrak fell to his knees, panting, broken not by blade, but by truth itself. His armor, once a monument to victory, now looked like ruin clinging to a failing man. He groped at the shards of his weapon but found only dust. And then, above it all, the Empress rose. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped from her throne, the first movement she had made since the human had entered her sight. When her feet touched the golden floor, silence fell heavier than gravity. She approached, passing Veyrak as one might pass a shadow too faint to matter. Her eyes, veiled yet burning, turned upon the fragile figure who had done what even legends could not. For the first time, the eternal Empress lowered her head in acknowledgement, not to a warlord, not to a priest, but to a human whose worth had been invisible until this hour. Her voice, steady as eternity, filled the chamber. The covenant is fulfilled. The fragile shall stand. Let the empire bear witness. The crowd erupted, their voices rising beyond the roof, beyond the stars, carrying proclamation where once there had been cruelty. And in that roar, in that thunder of shifting worlds, the Empress turned toward the human not as ruler to subject, but as one who had found something new, something even she had not conquered. Veyrak knelt in ruin. The empire trembled with revelation, and the man once mocked now stood at the center of a galaxy undone. But even in triumph, fate does not rest, for empires are slow to change, and every victory sows seeds of consequence. The fragile one had won the hall, the court, the Empress, yet what would victory demand of him in return? When the echoes of shattered steel faded, the hall lingered in silence vast as the void. The human still stood, unchanged yet transformed, no longer dust beneath the feet of empires, but the fragile hand that prophecy had crowned. The warlord Veyrak lay broken, kneeling amid the shards of his weapon. His pride twisted to ash, his authority scattered like embers. Some whispered his name with pity, others with contempt, but none with fear. Where once his shadow had loomed like a mountain, now he seemed nothing more than rubble upon the floor of history. And yet he was not slain. The Empress had not given command for his blood to stain the golden ground. He would live, marked not by triumph, but by humiliation greater than death. For in empires built on pride, disgrace is a wound that festers longer than any blade. The court itself was shaken. The mighty who had laughed only hours before now lowered their heads when the mechanic's gaze brushed near. Soldiers struck their armored chests in salute, their discipline cracked by awe. Even the priests, faces pale from the glow of prophecy fulfilled, stumbled over their honored hymns as they sought frantic new verses to explain what they had witnessed. The world they had trusted, the hierarchy etched into their bones, was faltering. Balance was shifting, and the Empress, though immortal in strength, was not untouched. Her figure remained radiant, but within her silence, something unspoken stirred. Thunder louder than wars. The empire itself was trembling, though its banners still flew high, and in the shadow of that trembling, the human returned to his silence. But no silence remains simple once history has carved it into memory. Something deep was shifting, and the galaxy could feel the weight of transformation begin. When all the voices of the hall had faded, when banners ceased their restless trembling, and when even the flames of Veyrak's shattered rage dwindled to silence, the human did what none expected. He did not seize a throne. He did not demand titles. He did not raise his hands to claim what prophecy had unveiled. He simply walked away, through corridors of obsidian and starlight, past bowed soldiers and silent priests. He returned to the shadows where he had always belonged. There, in the forgotten chambers of machinery and dust, he resumed his labor. His hands, marked from sparks and soot, wandered once again across neglected conduits, weary engines, quiet tools. The throne world may have crowned him immortal in memory, but he remained himself, the humble mechanic unseen by most, servant not to glory, but to purpose. Yet the world no longer looked at him through the lens of mockery. Whispers followed where silence once cloaked him. "There goes the fragile one," attendants murmured in awe. Children, eyes wide with wonder, traced the prophecy upon worn clay tablets, reminding one another of the day weakness unmade power. Songs began to stir, first in hushed corners, then in the streets, carrying the tale into the far provinces of the empire. And above all, upon her throne that blazed against galaxies, the Empress watched. She, who had commanded every kind of strength, had seen what no conquest could teach. That fragility, endured with patience, outweighed might. That to love and protect yielded a power that war alone could never wield. In her silence, an ember glowed, one she could not extinguish. Admiration, gratitude, something deeper, something perilous for one who ruled unchallenged. Her child, saved by hands unarmored, would grow into heirs who knew that their destiny was safeguarded not by swords, but by compassion. And though she never declared it before the court, in the hidden chambers of her heart, the Empress had given space to a truth forbidden, that in the humble mechanic, she had seen not weakness, but the shape of something eternal. Time would move on. Empires would reform, falter, and perhaps fall. Veyrak's disgrace would shadow him like a wound. New wars would rise, and new victories would ignite the heavens. But the tale of that day, the day the strongest ruler bowed her acknowledgement to the weakest hand, would endure long after banners turned to dust. For songs travel farther than armies. Memories outlast monuments. And children, listening to their mothers at dusk, would learn not of blades alone, but of the fragile mechanic who held the galaxy in balance, not by force, but by will. Empires are written in fire, legends in blood, but eternity remembers only truth. And the truth was simple. Strength is fleeting, frailty endures, and somewhere, in the quiet hum of old machines, a nameless human worked still, a small figure who had become a legend, whose story would live as long as stars.